you're charged with. Guilty is guilty.
She was just 6, but something about her presence felt timeless. The way she smiled, the way she found magic in the simplest things. It's what everyone remembers. They said it was an accident, a fall, maybe, a misstep on the stairs. But as details came forward, it became clear this was no ordinary emergency. Behind the front door of a quiet suburban home, something had gone wrong. She had been spending time with familiar faces, people who should have looked out for her, people who should have made her feel safe. And yet, here we are, years later, still asking the questions no one wants to ask. How was this allowed to happen? Who ignored the warning signs? And what was happening inside that home when no one was looking? This is not just a case about loss, it's a case about silence, about how easily harm can wear the mask of normalcy, about the difference between love and control, and how the line between the two can sometimes vanish without a sound. Today we revisit her story, not to relive the pain, but to bring clarity to the questions still echoing through her community. And to remind every viewer watching, sometimes the most important signs are the ones we're not supposed to see. Before we begin, a quick note. This story includes real-life events involving a young child and trusted individuals. We've taken care to present it in a respectful, responsible way, but viewer discretion is advised. And if this is your first time here, welcome. We'd love to have you join our growing community. Subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. And to my friends, to my returning viewers, thank you. Your immense support through likes, shares, and comments is the reason these stories continue to reach the people who need to hear them. Now let's get back to the story. Meika Jordan was 6 years old when her name would become the focus of a nationwide conversation. Not for anything she did wrong, but for the questions her case would leave behind. Before headlines, before courtrooms, and before investigators got involved, Meika was simply a little girl who saw beauty in the smallest details. She loved to sing, she danced whenever music played, and she had an affection for ladybugs that made everyone around her smile. They weren't just insects to her. She saw them as gentle companions, deserving of care, protection, and freedom. She was raised between two homes. Her mother, Kyla Jordan, had remarried and built a stable life with her husband, Woodhouse. Together they raised a family that blended smoothly. Kyla and Brian were actively involved, hands-on parents. In their home there was a structure to daily life, a clear rhythm marked by meals, school, and the shared joy of raising children close in age. Meika fit right in. She thrived. She laughed often, played with her siblings, and showed a natural independence that stood out, even at her young age. Kyla would later recall that Meika rarely complained, even when she took a tumble or got frustrated. She'd simply get up, smile, and move on. That resilience, that sense of joy, was one of the first things people mentioned when speaking about her. She had a lightness about her, an ability to bounce back no matter the situation. Her father, Spencer Jordan, lived nearby. After his separation from Kyla, he entered a new relationship with Magoon. The courts granted a joint custody agreement, which meant Meika and her younger brother Lee would alternate weeks between their mother's and father's homes. This type of arrangement is common and in many cases gives children a sense of continuity between both parents. It was assumed to be in Meika's best interest. At first, there was no sign that anything was unusual. Meika continued her routines. She'd return from her father's home and quickly re-engage with school, playtime, and family life. But over time, Kyla noticed subtle differences. Nothing that raised immediate concern, but just enough to wonder. On some days, Meika would seem quieter, a little more withdrawn, less bubbly than usual. The changes weren't drastic and they didn't last long. She always seemed to rebound after a day or two back at home. And that's what made things so complicated. There were no glaring signs, nothing that screamed for urgent intervention. The custody exchange was routine, and Meika never said anything that suggested she was afraid or uncomfortable. To those around her, life seemed stable. But beneath that surface, a different reality was starting to form, one that no one fully understood at the time. Spencer and Marie's household, from the outside, didn't raise any alarms. There were no official reports, no late-night phone calls. No one suspected that anything was wrong. And in shared custody situations, where parents rely on the assumption of mutual care, red flags aren't always obvious. This is what makes cases like Meika's so difficult to process. The circumstances didn't match what professionals typically watch for. There were no skipped school days, no missed checkups, no obvious warning signs to act on. And when concerns involve someone close to someone that is trusted to provide care, it can be even more difficult to recognize. Meika's story is a reminder that trust, while necessary, isn't always enough. Families navigating joint custody must not only rely on agreements, but stay alert to subtle shifts in a child's behavior, energy, or mood. These shifts, while easy to dismiss, might be the only signals that something deeper is going on. At that point in her life, Meika wasn't being monitored by the system. There were no ongoing investigations, no external red flags. She was, by all appearances, a healthy, active child with 2 homes and a large, caring, extended family. But behind the comfort of routine, something else was beginning to unfold. Quietly, invisibly, and without immediate signs. And no one saw it coming. In the days before emergency responders were called, a series of overlooked moments began to surface, quiet indicators that, on their own, didn't raise alarm. But when viewed together, they tell a more complicated story. Several neighbors would later recall seeing Meika outside. She appeared alone, absent from school, detached from her usual rhythm. One neighbor described watching her from across the street. Meika wasn't crying, she wasn't visibly hurt, but her posture was different. Her eyes stayed low. There was a noticeable shift, subtle, but enough to linger in the memory of those who saw her. That same weekend, Marie Magoon made a phone call to Alberta's health information line. She described a minor accident. Nothing serious, she said. According to the call records, she calmly explained that Meika had touched something hot and that there was a small injury to her hand. She asked whether medical attention was needed, then said she would wait and see. The conversation ended without urgency. The matter was left at that. It's now known that this call took place less than 48 hours before Meika was taken to the hospital. At the time, Kyla Jordan and her husband Brian had already begun raising questions. Over previous weeks, they had shared concerns with Alberta Child and Family Services. They described moments that didn't feel quite right. Small signs, shifts in Meika's behavior, and unexplained marks that made them uneasy. But with no clear pattern and no confirmed risk, their concerns weren't escalated. On Sunday, the scheduled custody exchange was due. Meika and her brother were meant to return to their mother's home, but that afternoon, Spencer Jordan reached out. He asked if he could keep the children one more day. He said they were spending time together and wanted to finish the weekend. Kyla agreed. She had no reason to object. The request didn't seem unusual. There was no argument, no warning, just a short call and a simple change of plans. But in hindsight, that extra day has taken on new meaning. It would be the final time Kyla would speak with her daughter while she was in Spencer's care. Within 24 hours, an emergency call would be made. First responders would arrive at a quiet residential address, and the investigation into what happened behind closed doors would begin. This section of the timeline matters, not because of an event, but because of an absence. There was no loud disruption, no visible incident, just a handful of moments that, together, suggest something was already happening beneath the surface. It's in these quiet shifts that the lesson lies. When a child's energy fades, when their routine changes without explanation, when a parent delays a handoff without much reason, these aren't always signs of crisis, but they're never meaningless. They're moments that deserve attention. For families, teachers, and professionals, the takeaway is simple but essential. Even the smallest change in a child's behavior or schedule can carry weight, especially when trust is involved. And especially when the explanation doesn't quite match the pattern, because often the days before everything changes look ordinary. It's only afterward that the questions begin. On November 13, 2011, just after 7 p.m., an emergency call was placed from a residential unit in Calgary. The caller was Magoon. She stated that her partner's young daughter had fallen down the stairs and was now unresponsive. First responders were dispatched immediately. Upon arrival, emergency personnel were met at the door by Marie. Inside the home was Spencer Jordan, the child's father. According to statements given at the scene, they claimed Meika had lost her footing and fallen. They described the situation as a household accident. But as medical responders began their evaluation, something didn't sit right. Meika was transported urgently to Alberta Children's Hospital. One of the doctors on duty that night was Dr. Guilfoyle, a senior pediatric specialist with years of clinical experience. The moment he assessed Meika, he grew concerned. The presentation of injuries did not line up with what had been described. The medical team noted inconsistencies, prompting further review. A full-body scan was conducted, including an MRI. The results added new questions. Medical findings showed multiple areas of concern, not all of them recent. The injuries varied in nature and appeared to have occurred over a longer period of time. This evidence cast doubt on the explanation of a single fall. While specialists worked tirelessly to stabilize Meika, she was placed on life support to manage her condition. For the next 16 hours, she was under continuous care. The goal was to buy time for her body to respond, time for recovery to be possible. But despite the team's efforts, there was no improvement. By the next afternoon, on November 14th, she showed no response to treatment. Her condition could not be reversed, and she was officially declared non-responsive to all medical intervention. She had passed away. Following protocol, a full examination was ordered. The report concluded that some of the injuries had occurred days earlier. The timing and pattern of these findings suggested that the incident on November 13th was not isolated. At this point, the Calgary Police Service was already involved. Officers had been notified as soon as the hospital began to question the circumstances. The file was transferred to the Homicide Division, and an official investigation was launched. The original account, that a child had fallen down a flight of stairs, was no longer supported by the evidence. Medical findings pointed to something else, something that had not happened all at once, but rather over a stretch of time. And that shift in timeline changed everything. The question was no longer if something had gone wrong, it was how long it had been happening and why no one had spoken up until now. Within hours of Meika's hospital admission, the Calgary Police Service launched a formal investigation. The file was quickly assigned to the Homicide Division, and the lead investigator was Detective Meika Jordan, a veteran officer known for his methodical, fact-driven approach. The initial interviews began almost immediately. Spencer Jordan and Marie Magoon sat across from detectives and maintained their explanation. Meika had fallen, not once, but several times. They described her as clumsy. They said she had been bumping into things all weekend. When asked for specifics, exact time sequences, or descriptions, they gave answers that were non-committal, short, repetitive. From the outside, it appeared they were cooperating, but to experienced investigators, something felt off. Officers noted the way both adults responded to basic questions. Their speech was measured, their posture relaxed, and their focus was more on aligning their stories than expressing concern. There was no visible panic, no uncertainty, no spontaneous emotion that typically follows an emergency involving a child in their care. While this unfolded, Meika's younger brother Lee was also brought to the station. He had been in the home at the time of the incident. Officers hoped he might help fill in some of the timeline, but during the interview, Lee was quiet, emotionally withdrawn. He didn't offer any statements, and the investigators decided not to apply pressure. They chose instead to focus their attention elsewhere. Unbeknownst to Spencer and Marie, the interrogation room was under full video and audio surveillance. Once left alone, the couple began to talk, thinking the conversation was private. What the recording captured became a pivotal moment in the case. In the footage, Spencer could be heard asking if Marie had said too much. Marie replied by checking if her version matched his. There was no talk of concern for Meika's condition, no questions about medical updates. The conversation was centered entirely on their statements and how believable they sounded. They weren't revisiting the event, they were revisiting the script. Detectives reviewed the footage in full. The content didn't include a confession, but it revealed something equally important: a shared effort to present a version of events that would hold up under scrutiny, a performance, not a recollection. This changed the direction of the investigation. It raised new questions about intention, timeline, and credibility. Why would two adults who had just experienced a critical medical emergency with a child in their home spend their time discussing what they'd told police? From that point on, the investigative lens sharpened. Detectives began cross-referencing past interactions, custody exchanges, and any prior reports. What had begun as a medical emergency now carried signs of a deeper issue, one that couldn't be explained by accidents or missteps alone. This was no longer a matter of conflicting accounts. It had become a matter of control, consistency, and whether the truth had ever been part of the conversation at all. With few solid leads and no direct admission, the Calgary Police Service was left with a case full of contradictions, but no formal breakthrough. The interviews had stalled, the medical evidence raised serious questions, but there was still no confession, and without one, prosecutors knew the burden of proof would be heavy. It was then that investigators chose to deploy a highly strategic and rarely publicized tactic, one that had proven effective in complex cases across Canada. Internally, it's referred to as the Mr. Big technique. The method works by creating a fictional criminal enterprise. Undercover officers pose as members of this organization and slowly integrate a suspect into their world. They offer friendship, income, protection, and ultimately status. But that status comes with one requirement: honesty. Full disclosure of anything from a suspect's past that could present a problem for the group down the line. The operation began quietly. Spencer Jordan was approached first. Officers made casual contact, initially presenting themselves as well-connected individuals offering cash-based jobs, small errands, quick payouts, no questions. As the relationship grew, they introduced him to a broader network, complete with hierarchy, structure, and influence. Once trust was built, the introduction to the supposed boss was arranged. At this stage, Spencer was told that before he could officially join the inner circle, he needed to be honest about anything in his background that could draw unwanted attention. The opportunity was framed as a chance to clear the slate, and he took it. In a recorded conversation, Spencer began to shift his version of events. He acknowledged that what had happened to Meika wasn't exactly as he'd first explained. He mentioned previous incidents, times where the situation at home had gotten difficult. It wasn't framed as an admission in the legal sense, but it was the first time he strayed from the narrative he had repeated since day one. In a separate operation, Mary Magoon was approached using the same method. She too was slowly drawn in and eventually confided in an undercover officer posing as part of the same network. She spoke about discipline in the home, about moments where things went too far, and how efforts were made to prevent Meika's mother from noticing changes that might raise questions during routine custody exchanges. Every word was captured on audio and video. The language was careful but revealing. There were no dramatic statements, no explicit claims, but the tone, the phrasing, and the timing all told a story investigators had been trying to uncover since the beginning. There was, however, a challenge. Under Canadian law, statements obtained through a Mr. Big operation are not automatically admissible in court. In order to be used as evidence, these confessions must be backed by independent verification corroboration through physical evidence, witness testimony, or forensic data. The safeguard is designed to prevent false admissions made under pressure or in pursuit of reward. Still, in this case, the operation achieved something important. It shifted the narrative. It provided insight into what Spencer and Marie privately believed they could get away with. And it proved that the story told to law enforcement was carefully crafted, not spontaneous. Though the confessions themselves couldn't stand alone in trial, they pushed the case forward. They gave prosecutors a stronger foundation to challenge the initial claims of an accident, and they allowed detectives to revisit the evidence with sharper focus, tying timelines together, identifying behavioral patterns, and exposing inconsistencies in earlier statements. The Mr. Big operation didn't close the case, but it cracked it open. It showed that beneath the surface of control, a different truth had started to emerge, one built not on emotion or panic, but on calculated decisions, shaped over time and hidden behind quiet restraint. And that truth would soon face its first major test inside a courtroom. In 2014, nearly 3 years after the original emergency call, the Crown laid formal charges against Spencer Jordan and Marie Magoon. Investigators had gathered extensive evidence, medical analysis, behavioral findings, and corroborating testimony. The prosecution was confident it had what it needed to move forward. The charges related to the sequence of events that had placed 6-year-old Meika Jordan in critical condition. By the time the case reached the courts, it had already drawn national attention, not just because of the outcome, but because of the questions it raised about accountability, shared custody, and trust inside the family home. The trial began in 2015. It took place in a Calgary courtroom, with legal teams on both sides preparing for a complex, emotionally weighted case. The prosecution argued that the events in question did not reflect a one-time incident. Instead, they pointed to repeated behavior that, in their view, showed intent and control. The defense claimed that what happened lacked intent and unfolded over a brief high-stress window. Each side called expert witnesses. Cross-examinations followed, and in the public gallery, Kyla Jordan and her husband Brian Woodhouse took their place, every day, without fail. They didn't speak to media, they didn't react to testimony, they simply watched. The courtroom became the only place where they could hear in detail what had taken place beyond the walls of their own home. At the conclusion of the trial, the court issued its decision. Both Spencer and Marie were found responsible. The charge was classified as second degree, a legal term used when someone causes a person's passing intentionally but without advance planning. Each was sentenced to life in prison with no eligibility for parole for 17 years. The outcome, however, did not bring closure. The Crown appealed the ruling. Prosecutors believe that the evidence presented during trial justified a more serious classification. They pointed to the consistency of behavior, the timeline of events, and the efforts made to obscure the truth in the aftermath. They argued this wasn't a moment of panic. It was something that had unfolded over time. In 2017, the Alberta Court of Appeal agreed. The original ruling was reviewed and revised. Based on the findings, both convictions were elevated to first degree, the most serious classification in Canadian law, applied when actions are considered premeditated or carried out in a deliberate, prolonged manner. The sentencing was updated accordingly. Life imprisonment, with no chance of parole for 25 years, that ruling didn't go unchallenged. The defense escalated the case to the Supreme Court of Canada. Their legal team contended that the elevation of the charge was inconsistent with earlier interpretations of intent. They asked for a full review, arguing that the timeline and available evidence did not meet the national standard for the higher classification. After consideration, the Supreme Court upheld the appellate decision. The reclassification stood. The convictions were final. For Meika's family, the ruling brought a form of resolution, though not a simple one. Justice hadn't come quickly, and it hadn't come without resistance, but it had come. The case also echoed beyond the courtroom. Legal observers pointed to the verdict as a rare example of how sustained behavioral patterns, even when not accompanied by a single defining moment, can still be recognized by the courts as deliberate. It challenged the way responsibility is measured, it raised the bar for accountability, and it reminded the public that some forms of harm are quiet, gradual, and difficult to detect until it's too late. In the end, this wasn't just about a legal label, it was about truth, accountability, and the long path toward justice for a young girl who had no voice in the courtroom, but whose story was finally heard. The conclusion of the trial did not close the chapter for Meika Jordan's family. If anything, it opened another one centered on reflection, emotional impact, and the quiet, enduring presence of grief that doesn't fade when the cameras turn off. A private memorial was held in Calgary to honor Meika's life. It wasn't filled with speeches or headlines. It was quiet, respectful. A single princess balloon hovered gently over the room as her favorite song played. It was a simple tribute to a child remembered for her joy, her curiosity, and the energy she brought into every space she entered. Among those in attendance were Kyla Jordan and Woodhouse. The weight they carried had been visible in court, but here, in the stillness of the service, it became more personal. Brian, who had helped raise Meika as his own, stood beside Kyla with a quiet strength. Their composure spoke to years of endurance. Their grief was not loud, but it was there, unmistakable in the silence between words. Observers would later contrast that emotional presence with the absence of any visible response from Spencer Jordan. During the legal proceedings, his demeanor was flat, detached. There were no outward signs of remorse, no reaction to the sentencing, just stillness. And while courts don't judge emotion, those watching could not help but feel the contrast. But beyond the courtroom and the service, something larger was taking shape. Support began to pour in, not just from family and friends, but from strangers. Online communities rallied behind Kyla's family. Messages arrived from across the country. Some were from parents who had followed the case closely. Others were from individuals who had never met Meika, but felt deeply affected by what her story represented. Community organizations held conversations around family dynamics, safety, and silent warning signs. In some schools, teachers used the moment to reinforce the value of speaking up, of trusting instincts, and of building open lines of communication between students and adults. Though no major policy reform followed, the case left a mark. It made people more aware of what can happen behind closed doors, even in households that appear stable. It opened up discussions around joint custody, emotional wellness, and the need to look beyond appearances. In some communities, it encouraged professionals to revisit how behavioral shifts are monitored when children are transitioning between homes. Perhaps most importantly, it forced a deeper public understanding of how harm can exist in quiet, hidden ways, not always through dramatic events, but through patterns, through silence, through the absence of attention when it matters most. Today, Meika is remembered not through the headlines that surrounded her case, but through the moments she shared with those closest to her. Her laughter, her drawings, her love of music and bright colors. The joy she found in everyday things. And for many, her story became a turning point, a reason to pay closer attention, ask harder questions, and be more present in the lives of the children around them. Because sometimes the smallest details, the quiet shifts, the subtle changes, carry the biggest meaning, and Meika's legacy now lives on in those who choose to notice. There's a quiet truth that this case has brought to light, one that often goes unspoken. Trust can be misused, even by those within the closest circles. People often assume safety comes from familiarity, from shared last names, from routine. But as Meika's story has shown us, that assumption isn't always enough. It's easy to miss the signs. Subtle changes in a child's mood, interest, or energy can be passed off as growing pains or mood swings. But when those shifts persist or show up around certain people or environments, they may deserve a second look. A child who becomes withdrawn, a child who stops speaking up. These are not always signs of rebellion. Sometimes they're a quiet call for help. In co-parenting and shared custody arrangements, clear communication is not optional. When both households don't share updates or concerns, things can slip through unnoticed. A bruise explained away, a story that doesn't quite add up. These moments should never be dismissed, especially when a child can't fully explain what they're feeling. Professionals like teachers, doctors, and counselors play a critical role too. If something seems off emotionally, physically, or behaviorally, it should be noted. Documentation, even without immediate action, can help build a picture over time. That vigilance can be what connects the dots when others don't. Children may not always know how to say something is wrong. They may not know the right words, but they give signals in how they act, in what they stop doing, in who they stop wanting to be around. Our job is to listen closely and without assumptions. Because safety isn't just about procedures or systems, it's about presence. It's about asking the follow-up question when something doesn't sit right, and it's about creating a space where children know their voice matters, even if they're still learning how to use it. Meika Jordan's story reminds us of what can happen when those signals are missed, but more importantly, it reminds us what it looks like to keep watching, keep asking, and keep caring long after the news cameras have gone. We want to thank you for staying with us through this case, for honoring Meika's memory not just by watching but by reflecting. If this story left an impression on you, we encourage you to share it so other people can learn from it, become aware, and it might just save a life. Conversations like this are where change begins, at home, in schools, in our community groups, and in the way we respond when a child's behavior quietly shifts. Let us know in the comments your thoughts about this case and where you're watching from if you haven't already. And if you haven't already, subscribe and join us as we continue to explore stories and lessons that deserve to be heard with care, with clarity, and with purpose. Because sometimes it's not the loudest moments that matter. Sometimes the warning signs are the ones we weren't meant to notice. I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe and always stay aware.